easier, and the familiarity that was coming from peatlands and then draining them in those places as well. But this is also something that we felt we didn't have enough research on to kind of speak really concretely about. So we're kind of exploring different ways that we could have a global focus for this session, whilst also having the focus or having the, let's say, like onus on the UK, that it wasn't that we were then shifting any blame or anything like that, or not having the UK context included. So, and then also we didn't want to have a very individualistic focus as well. So that's why we kind of chose to have it in the way that you'll have it today, where we're just going to be exploring a little bit the UK's role in global peatlands and kind of the consumerist capitalist model, and then also artistic practices that are then very decolonial, and exploring how we can go forward from the place that we're currently in. So the first person who's going to be joining us today is Khairani Barokka. And Khairani is, or Oka, sorry, I should say, is an environmental writer and artist from Jakarta, and her work centers disability justice as anti-colonial practice. And she's just going to be exploring a little bit with us today the Indonesian peatland context with the UK, and the element of the consumerist capitalist model as well, or system that we're in. And then the second part of the session, we were going to have an artistic duo join us called A Place of Their Own, which is Paula McCloskey and Sam Vardy. But unfortunately, they don't have good enough internet with them today to join us. So we just have a pre-recorded element that we're going to show of theirs. And it's just their presentation. It just will be a little bit less dynamic, I suppose. And then we're going to move on to a discussion at the end. So I think maybe then I will just pass already over to you then, Oka. And we'll keep admitting people as they come in, but you can already take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Bethany, Marilise, Poppy, everyone, RE-PEAT, for having me and for inviting me. As mentioned, I am an Indonesian writer and artist. I am currently based in London, so I have sort of both sides of understanding geographically of the peatland situation. You might be asking yourself, why did they invite a writer and artist to this? So I currently work at University of the Arts London's Decolonizing Arts Institute. I'm UK Associate Artist at Delphina Foundation, and this year I'm also Associate Artist at the National Center for Writing. And I grew up in a context of Indigenous environmental activism. I'm Minang Javanese. And so I always knew, growing up my entire life, how there are environmental truths at the grassroots level, on the ground floor, that never make it into national media, right? Let alone international media. So I feel quite privileged actually in that sense. And all of my books, from the book Indigenous Species onwards to my latest one, Ultimatum Orangutan in Indonesian, or Ultimatum Orangutan in English. It's a bilingual title, which I'll be reading from a little bit today, are all very much about environmental justice. Ultimatum Orangutan specifically is about this phrase is often said, especially when you work at a decolonizing institute, colonial legacies, right? But I really have to point out that colonialism is very much present, and there's a trajectory into the future. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the United States, these are all colonial nations, right? I believe that Native American academic Nick Estes said, post-colonialism, have they left? You know, I mean, it is so much a world of settler colonialism still. So I've learned to be a bit careful when I say colonial legacies, because in the UK especially, there's the tendency to act as though it's over, it's completely over. And yet no, you know, the anthropologist Anne-Laura Stoller, who's worked a lot on Indonesia and colonial impact on Indonesia, has talked about how, you know, there are colonialism's infrastructures that are, in her words, hardened and now more intractable than stone. So I think I'd like to begin with a poem. And first of all, just to explain a little bit of the cover. So this is my hand with like a Hadouken energy ball against a bulldozer. And the landscape in the background, the purple landscape, is a photo of Tanah Datar in West Sumatra, where my mother's family is from. So this book is for 4 of my grandmothers. We're Minangkabau, we're the largest matrilineal society in the world, actually, which a lot of people don't know. But the bloodlines pass through the mother. Women own land, women own property, and you know, the wealth. So that might explain why I'm a bit stubborn. I'm going to read from a poem called Situation Report. And before that, I also just want to describe, for those of you who might be blind or sight impaired, I'm a brown-skinned woman with glasses, lipstick. Behind me are 2 framed paintings of watercolors. I'm wearing a white shirt. Okay, so Situation Report. Waiting for melt, against melt, casual melt, the melt with no name, the melt with white fur rubbing up and down against it bloody, melt with heat-stricken elderly, found alone and decomposing on a settee melt. The melt of the many swollen, drowning and ballooning clothes found in a shelter melt, the melt that stops hormonal ovarian urges. Melt of the frost, melt of the winter screensaver, melt of the world's encased and iciest breath on window panes, melt of the sand into oceanic debris, melt of handed down wisdom, collapsed into capital, melt of the on the fencers, melt of the named storms, melt of the aftermaths, melt of no power, no pain medication in climate refugee camps, no shield against rape in climate refugee camps, running melt of the humming as tick, tick, tock, melt of the quiet as a waiting, melt of the insignificance of adenine, guanine, thymine, cytosine, melt of the clawing significance, melt of the nation states, melt of the coastal tribes, melt of the rainforest hindering quick, melt of the quickening and left for dead in industrial dumps, melt of pulp trees for warnings to be read and cause insomnia, melt of industrial revolution as imposed upon former colonies, current colonies, melt of the fallacies, melt of the tiredness, melt of the upswell, melt of the hot laugh, melt of the baby hope, melt of babe despair, melt of supremacy framed brown babies running from charity donation ads. Each melt says, good God, this is the first. Each melt says, this is the big one. Thank you. So when I was younger, I thought I would grow up to be another environmental activist in the vein of other people in my family, but I'm really terrible at biology, actually, and labs. I'm very clumsy. So I discovered that through what I'm actually, would actually really like, and thank you for listening, is communicating to people environmental through art and writing. And I think sometimes that penetrates where maybe a lot of jargon might not be able to, right? So I always like to try and begin with a poem. So Indonesia in 2009 was listed as having 60% of the world's tropical peatlands. Today, that number is more like 36%, and that already tells you so much, right? Just that drop. We are also the world's largest producer of palm oil, which is extremely destructive. So when I tell people, when I'm invited to speak about the climate, and I say, I see a lot of people moving towards plant-based diets and plant-based everything, you have to understand that not all plants are good. Palm oil trees and palm oil plantations are deeply destructive to ecosystems, to families. It kills. It really, plantations are instances of land grab, often forcibly, often through violence. And it means Indigenous peoples can no longer have the lives they once did. So I really ask people to think about what you have in your house. And often palm oil isn't listed as palm oil. If you Google just like derivatives of palm oil, there's so many different things that are listed as, for instance, SLS, right? Like sodium lauryl sulfate, which is in everything, which is in soaps, shampoos, laundry detergents, right? That actually comes from palm oil, even if it's not listed as palm oil. So do look at those as well. And do try to shift to no palm oil brands. This is so important. A lot of people say, but some brands use sustainable palm oil. I am of the understanding and this is based on, again, as I said, a lifetime of living within, indigenous environmental movements. There is no such thing as truly 100% sustainable palm oil. There's no such thing. That is the opinion of myself and my communities. And in a bit, I'll give you a few examples of why it's really hard to monitor for actual sustainability and the different ways that big corporations are using to maneuver laws, right? And to flat out lie in a lot of instances, to cook the books, as they say, to present false statistics, especially when you're dealing with corrupt governments, etc. But I think I'd want to begin by sort of telling you a little bit about Indonesia, because I'm sure not everybody here has been to Indonesia. Maybe people are wondering, why are you even here talking about the UK context in Indonesia? As Bethany said, the Dutch were the primary colonizers of Indonesia for hundreds of years, including a slave trade that involved more than 1 million men, women, and children, but isn't often talked about. But I'm actually currently working on projects that aim to show, the British also colonized Indonesia. There was a period called the British Interregnum period in the early 1800s, where for 4 years, the Dutch East Indies were actually British property. There's also the French Interregnum for a period in the early 1800s, right? So I'm really trying to get people to see beyond this one-to-one relationship when it comes to colonialism. Because the fact is the histories are so vast that when you talk about climate injustice, and I like how, you put in the title of this event, it's like in brackets. I think it's easy to say the Dutch, Indonesia, the British, Malaysia. But again, these are colonial borders, right? These are colonial delineations of land that are completely false. And the British also colonized Indonesia for periods of time. And when you're talking about the present day and the 20th century, the 21st century, I'm just going to give you a little bit of a brief overview of the UK-Indonesia connection and why, the colonial context for peatlands. Okay, so when you're talking colonialism, as I hope you all know, it's pure evil, right? As I said, in Indonesia, it involved a literal slave trade, and many deaths for spices and various other resources, and it became to be, what we think of as like whole ecosystems, or as my father calls life spaces, right? Life spaces rather than natural resources, because that implies that it's just nature is something for us to take from. So I don't actually like using the term natural resources. It was completely and utterly exploitative. There is no sense of doing anything that is for the welfare of indigenous peoples under European colonialism, right? So you have to understand that peatlands in Indonesia and indigenous peoples who live on peatlands in Indonesia, which currently I think there are around 500 or more different peatland ecosystems within Indonesia. We have over 17,000 islands. We have the world's longest coastline, right? Because of the different islands. I think width to width, we're about as wide as the United States, to give you a picture, because I know often there are Eurocentric maps that show Indonesia as like a group of tiny islands, and it's like, no, actually. And we're also the 4th largest country by population, which is a thing that not very many people know about. So you've got the history of European colonization, right? Indonesia is seen as a place of natural resources to extract, to bring resources to Europe, right? And that actually didn't stop it. It's not stopping now. So that's why I say like colonialism hasn't actually stopped. So in 1945, Indonesia gains independence. Then in 65, 66, you have a genocide. You have a genocide that, probably impacted maybe 2 million people of suspected communists, quote unquote. But really it meant sexual minorities, ethnic minorities, leftists of any kind, right? A literal massacre of the Indonesian women's movement. And I grew up, because I grew up in an activist family, I'm lucky that I grew up with a lot of exile artists around me who have since been able to return. I grew up knowing people who have had to change their name because their family was associated with communism. It's kind of like a red letter, like once your family is deemed communist, you don't get the same rights as everyone else. There's lots of imprisonments. And this genocide was enabled by the US and its allies, including the UK, right? And it enabled a dictatorship under President Suharto, who after the coup, that lasted 33 years. So this began when my mother was around 9 years old. And that age is significant because I grew up under that dictatorship also. And at the age of around 9, 8 or 9, I was irreversibly traumatized by really violent mythology and understandings of like feminists as evil and all of this stuff from the schools, from the government, even though my parents had told me everybody's going to lie to you. It's basically mass traumatization of Indonesian generations, right? That happens to people when we're around 8 or 9. In 98, Suharto is deposed. Now, why did this genocide happen is because the Cold War was happening at the time, right? So you have the US and allies creating genocides, obviously not just in Indonesia, right? You have what happened in Latin America. You have Chile and Pinochet, right? You have South Korea and, the dictatorship over there. There are parallel genocides and dictatorships happening around the world in the name of spreading democracy, supposedly, right? But in fact, Suharto's was a capitalist dictatorship. And it allowed US and UK and European concessions to go in and again begin to more, even more rapaciously take our lands as natural resources, right? Structural adjustment programs came in because of the International Monetary Fund, Bretton Woods institutions, including the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank and such, that imposed a lot of debt on countries that have already been stolen from. And recently I was on a podcast talking about my book, Ultimatum Orangutan, and somebody said, wow, it really shows, because the book is all about colonialism and the environment, this book really shows the debt that we have in the developed world to the rest of the world. And I said, please cut the words developed world out of this podcast, which they kindly agreed to, because I don't believe in that terminology. This supposed hierarchy, it's like a diagram of the evolution of man, right? From underdeveloped to developing to developed world is a lie, because in Indonesia and countries in Africa, we're not poor, we're exploited. And so what you're doing is you're stealing from people. You're taking, coltan from mines in Africa. You're taking palm oil, you're taking rainforests and peatlands and turning them into palm oil plantations. You're stealing, on top of the colonial theft of billions of pounds, you're continuing to steal from people, and then you blame us for not being developed enough when you impose the Industrial Revolution on us. And you act like they'll catch up, I mean, it's it's quite insidious. And a part of my job as an educator is I want to get people to stop using these terms of like developing country, like we'll get there eventually. It's like, what, we would have gotten there ages ago if you didn't keep stealing from us. Really, that is the truth. 100%. I mean, I think we all know, there are only a certain number of dozens of corporations responsible for the greatest climate injustices, right? Yet the focus is often on climate change, not system change. And I don't see people on the everyday in the mainstream, which I know is why we're here, really calling out these corporations in the way that they need to be, right? Because governments protect them. And countries like Indonesia don't necessarily have the power or even the political will, because of corruption and different things, to call out these companies as well. So you're dealing with a very fraught situation. So under a capitalist dictatorship, there were a lot of not so bright ideas that the dictator Suharto imposed on indigenous peoples' lands, including peatlands, right? So for instance, in the early 90s, Suharto wanted Indonesia to become a rice bowl, quote unquote, which sounds like a delicious dish you get at a food court. But what's meant by that is because, back home we eat rice for every meal, 3 times a day, right? So the idea was to have Indonesia be the largest producer of rice in our region. And to do that, they drained the peatlands, right, to turn it into rice production en masse, like factory style, mass production, not the very ethical, like indigenous, these kinds of paddy fields that are on a small scale. I don't want people to think all paddy fields are bad, right? Hashtag not all paddy fields, right? But the idea then was to turn peatlands into rice production en masse. And of course, that was not such a good idea, because then, weather changes happened and enormous fires spread throughout these peatlands that were, turned into rice plantations. So that was another idea that didn't work. And then now you have palm oil plantations that are taking peatlands from people. And as I mentioned, this is often done with force. It's underreported. And there's, talk of sustainable palm oil plantations. But for instance, there are companies like APP, Asian Pulp and Paper, that say, okay, we have a monitoring, we're being monitored. There's a quote unquote dashboard. That's what they call it. They say we have a dashboard that shows you that, our palm oil plantations are completely ethical and sustainable. Yet there's still clearing of peatlands being done. So organizations are like, you say it's completely sustainable. So why are you, if you say that these are protected areas, right? Why are you not protecting them, And so there are all kinds of lawyers for these corporations continue to find all kinds of ways to like slip between the cracks. So one of the ways, for instance, is apart from, the usual, we call it KKN, corruption, collusion, and nepotism that happens, to impede good governance in countries like Indonesia, which again, colonial histories have enabled us, have impeded our ability to have good governance, is, for instance, companies will say, okay, these are sustainable palm oil plantations. They will be listed as sustainable palm oil plantations, but they will be on lands that, for instance, were peatlands or were rainforest, but they just bought the already existing palm oil plantations. I hope I'm making myself clear. So what I mean is, so let's say there's an area of rainforest or an area of peatlands. It's cleared, often forcibly, forcing indigenous peoples off their lands. We can't even go back to, sustainably harvest like firewood from the lands of our ancestors because these are owned by companies now. And they will say, oh, we bought this palm oil plantation, so we didn't have to clear any peatlands or rainforests to start our operation. So therefore we are sustainable, quote unquote. And it's like, no, you just because you didn't do the clearing yourself, the previous owner, the previous corporations did. So I'm just giving you these examples to show like, please like be very, very, very critical, because on the ground, the reality is extremely violent and extremely dangerous. And extremely dishonest. And there are sites like Manga Bay that I know that you're familiar with that try to report on these in a bit more depth. But for the most part, as I'm sure you know, it doesn't get reported on in Europe. People don't even think about, the instant noodles that we use, the soaps that we use that are so cheap. It all comes at the expense of people being forced off their lands and killed. And a lot of violence done environmentally also in terms of pollution. All right, so that Suharto's capitalist dictatorship enabled all of this stuff to go on. It's still continuing. And I want to say that there are people from my community, when I said I was doing this gig, who said, this isn't it. You need to talk about CO2 colonialism, which is like, when my dad talks about life space, sometimes talks about CO2 colonialism, which is like carbon colonialism, right? I'm going to read from an academic who's wonderful called Larry Lohmann, Lohmann, who is a white man who lives in the UK, who has, he is friends with my communities. And he said, like being in the global South, and if you want to call it that, and being with grassroots activists has taught me how much our carbon regime is not only so infused with whiteness, but with white supremacy. And what I mean by that is, I'm reading from Larry right now. He says, an additional, quote, in italics, racialized landscape of climate policy, full of, for example, white industrialists cheaply seizing the lands of faraway non-white humans to, quote unquote, neutralize the pollution that they continue to park cheaply in the usual nearby human bodies. Or despoiling land and degrading often non-white labor to produce, quote unquote, renewable goods certified as, quote unquote, climate friendly, according to IPCC scientists' definition of, quote unquote, climate. So you have to understand, I hear people say often, I did a gig at Cambridge recently, somebody was like, science is universal. I'm like, actually, no. Ethnobotany is not universal, right? The way science is employed is deeply political. And what's happened is, because the energy landscape, because of the Industrial Revolution being forced on colonies, as I wrote about in my poem, is deeply racialized, right? even in a country like the United States, where I did a lot of schooling of higher education, you have people living near power plants, right, who are predominantly Black and brown. So you have to understand that the energy landscape is so racialized, right? And then you get this understanding of the science of carbon. It becomes, okay, we have to, as I'm sure you're all aware of, with IPCC, COP, everything, it becomes about carbon limits, right? Beyond which things are already scary now. The climate is already changing. In Indonesia, we have 2 seasons, wet and dry, and they're already getting interchangeable with each other. It's already quite scary. As you all know, above a certain level of the carbon, it will get even scarier, right? Like extinction even more. But the thing is, in my book, I quote 2 anthropologists, Zoe Todd and Heather Davis. And Zoe Todd is an Indigenous scholar, and they cite that their knowledge is from Indigenous communities, right? Academia, which I know very well, can be about like, I discovered this. And again, scientific discovery, also highly colonial. They say this is information that, lots of Indigenous communities around the world know, which is that the title of their article, which I cite in my book, is entitled The Importance of a Date or Decolonizing Anthropocene. And they say, I see so many of my peers, especially in the UK, where there's so much eco-fascism and not enough perspectives from the quote unquote global South, saying Anthropocene is 100 years old. It began with the Industrial Revolution. Actually, according to lots of Indigenous communities, Anthropocene began with the advent of European colonialism. So we're talking 500 years ago. And why? Because that is the beginning of the severing of the relationships, as Todd and Davis say, between nature, mind, and body. And the concept of nature, right? Again, with regards to peatlands and natural resources, the concept of nature is deeply settler colonial. And I want you to think about conservation areas, which carbon trading schemes allow for, right? That says, okay, we have bought this whole area, it's conserved, but it no longer belongs to Indigenous peoples as a result, who are the #1 best caretakers of natural lands. Of peatlands, of rainforests, Indigenous peoples, we are the #1 best caretaker. The UN acknowledges this. And yet we're being forced from our lands because of carbon trading schemes. So you have to understand that these so-called nature-based solutions, which have increased since 2009, are actually creating more climate problems. Because what's happening is there are companies in Indonesia who's, let's say, okay, I've bought this whole concession of carbon. I have this many carbon credits. They are backdoor not sometimes even front door. A lot of these companies, it's open secret. They're selling it to companies like Shell. So now you have Indigenous lands that are owned by Shell so that they can increase their pollution. This is not sustainability. And by the way, the issue of sustainability is often the sustainability of Western consumerist lifestyles. So when I hear the word sustainability, it's like, you mean how much you can continue living the good life, right? Rather than how do we change these colonial capitalist systems so that genocides that have already been happening, as I say, the 65-66 genocide is to me also an environmental genocide because it happened so that companies could gain access to our lands. And these carbon regimes are really unsustainable, if you even want to use that word. I said I would go back to the issue of, the understanding of companies being very, quote unquote, responsible, right, with the environment, this carbon regime. So one thing that you have to understand is that, I'm quoting again here from Larry Lohman. Okay, in 2014, Sir John Houghton, Houghton, founding member of the IPCC, gave an interview explaining why IPCC scientists could not mention the carbon in fossil fuels or fossil fuel extractivism, very strange, right, in their analysis of climate change, but only carbon that had become more mobile in the form of CO2. I'm going to repeat this. So in 2014, a founding member of the IPCC, Sir John Houghton, he gave an interview and he said, IPCC scientists are not allowed to mention the carbon in fossil fuels or fossil fuel extractivism. They can only mention the carbon. So you're not actually attacking companies like Shell. You're not actually attacking companies like BP because you're not allowed to. Again, from Lohman here, I'm quoting. To follow what happens when carbon atoms move over the border into the atmosphere is quote unquote science, Houghton said. But to analyze what happens to make so many carbon atoms migrate in this way, quote unquote, is not a science question. So you see how science is political, and you see how the idea of carbon regime is political. Because carbon is seen as a science question. Fossil fuel extractivism that fuels, carbon pollution is not seen as science. It's seen as politics, and IPCC scientists are told to keep mum about it. So this is the landscape we're dealing with. And you see a lot of indigenous activists being impoverished, being kicked out of their homes, being like literally beaten up, and not reported on. But I can tell you, I will promise you that this is really true, happening on the grassroots level. And so people think they're being sustainable because of carbon offsets. But you can't even police those carbon offsets because, as I said, the idea of sustainability, there's so many loopholes. And if you talk about carbon, rather than indigenous sovereignty over indigenous lands, which I'm telling you, if we do not eradicate colonial capitalism and return indigenous sovereignty, all you're doing is stirring a pot. You're not actually making the problem go away. You're making it worse. You're making it worse because you're eradicating more and more indigenous peoples from our lands and putting our lands in the control of companies like Shell by virtue of Indonesian companies and their subsidiaries. So thank you for your time. It's a little bit of my time. I'm gonna read a little bit of the chat, and then I'm looking forward to seeing the presentation that comes after and having a discussion with you afterwards.
Thank you, Oka. That was just so rich. I can already feel the need to kind of go back and have a listen again and be wary myself of the decolonization that needs to happen within my own mind and within the language that I use right off the bat, using colonial legacies, for example. So thank you. That was really, really powerful. So I'm wondering now if anyone has any direct questions to Oka, and otherwise we would then maybe shift any more general questions or any questions that could link with the other talk to the end. So perhaps you can also just indicate in the chat if you have a direct question or two already. And if not, we'll come back during the discussion aspect anyway. I'm just scrolling a little bit through as well to see. And I think a lot of people are sending links and being very enthusiastic. I don't see any questions yet. I'll just give you another few seconds to put any in if you want to, anyone. I think and maybe I also speak for myself, but maybe other people as well, that it's maybe a sense of absorbing first and then coming back to a question once it's had time to percolate a little bit. In which case, Marilis, I would hand over to you then to share your screen for the place of their own. And I mentioned this at the start already that unfortunately they're not able to join us this evening because of a Wi-Fi issue. So we have a pre-recorded presentation from them. And if there's any kind of questions that you want to direct towards them afterwards, we can always kind of facilitate that conversation as well. But for now, we'll just watch their presentation, I think. And you can keep writing things in the chat. We'll keep an eye on it and monitor if some of those questions are ones we return back to at the end. Okay, go ahead, Marilis.
Thank you, Oka. Thank you, Bethany. I'm just gonna go ahead and start the video. I hope everything works as supposed to. If someone sees any issues, please immediately you can interrupt me.
Talk about our work with wetlands. We're travelling at the moment, but we hope to join you for the discussion at the end of this series of talks.
So just briefly, A Place of Their Own has been operating for about 10 years now, and we've undertaken a range of projects across art, spatial research. We make films, we do performances, we do installations. We've worked on the Irish border in the other project from 2016. We did a recent project again in Ireland, Yeah We Breathe, as a way to approach the public realm. And another example of project is Geopower, or Spatial Self-Organisation Against Injustice, from last year, which we did in Sheffield, about the politics of extraction and bringing together mining communities and kind of anti-fracking communities. I think across the work that we do, something that is really important for us, we work quite a lot with, like in the project we're talking about today, the way that art can bring us towards new imaginaries. But what we think is really key with that is that those imaginaries make space for other imaginaries and other people's imaginaries and other species imaginaries at the same time. And this quote from Subcommandant Marcos from Zapatistas in Mexico, "The world we want is one with space for many worlds," really resonates with our practice. So Myth Through Wetlands Imaginary was a project that we completed last year. It was commissioned by Arts Catalyst for Waltham Forest Borough Council for their Art Assembly programme, which was a festival and series of residency projects with 5 organisations around the UK, exploring radical forms of social engaged art. We worked with London Wildlife Trust, with biodiversity officers from Thames Water, with writers such as Susan Butler, and sound artists, in this case Gary Stewart.
So some of the, which I guess are elements that go across all our practices, but for Myths for Wetlands Imaginary, that we were exploring some of these themes and concepts and practices. So just listing them in no particular order, but think about ecology. It's transdisciplinary. So as Sam said, we're working with a range of collaborators, working with scientists as well as members of the community and artists and different types of artists. It's collective, so it was our inquiries, our practice is works with different people from who have different, bringing their own knowledges. New Imaginary, so we've talked a bit about the how our work is, that we see the potential of art research specifically as being generative of new imaginaries, which we'll talk a bit more about. And importantly for this conference, we always work from a position of how can we think beyond the human and think more in more than human terms about how we approach each project. And whether it's our research questions or our methods, and or our collaborators, our collective. So our collective is expanded beyond the humans to non-humans, and again we'll talk a bit about that within the rest of the presentation. And this idea of myth poesis. So this is connected to the new imaginaries, but it's really about thinking about how, for Myth Through Wetlands Imaginary, how we can create fictions and new myths for the wetlands. So
wetlands are one of the most important and threatened natural ecosystems on the earth, and they can be found all across the globe in different types of climatic conditions. And we were interested in exploring the wetlands because Waltham Forest is host to the Walthamstow wetlands, which is a place that we'll introduce in a little bit more detail in a moment. But the wetlands as a kind of a global figure of many kind of key markers of our time at the moment. So the impact that capitalism and colonialism in particular have on our kind of lives and the lives of others at the moment. So wetlands are being destroyed across the globe and have been historically for decades. And a number of global organizations are exploring this. And we were interested in the way that there was a connection between the destruction of wetlands over the last 100 years and various forms of settler colonialism, with many of the world's kind of major cities built on wetlands and having destroyed them to make way for the cities. So the project was really about this kind of ecological kind of exploration of the importance of wetlands and how we could explore that through this art project.
And it situates this loss of wetlands and their global destruction due to carbon and capitalist imaginaries. It situates wetlands occupying this kind of paradoxical position. So while their destruction, like we said, is due to carbon and capitalist imaginaries, they hold the potential to open up new imaginaries through their unique ecologies, biological processes, entanglements of human and non-human, and their local and global relevance in enabling different knowledges. So I think this is very much goes to this particular project, where it was where we worked with the specific sites of the Walthamstow wetlands, but then would bring in this kind of global perspective.
So as Paula said, the project was really thinking about the way that the wetlands might be a figure through which we could collectively and transdisciplinarily work with this notion of bringing in, through the art, new imaginaries. And Mark Fisher, in the book Capitalist Realism, just comments that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And this really helps us kind of frame the need for new imaginaries beyond the dominant imaginaries that we have of carbon and capital. So the project, like Paula said, was very specifically local, with Walthamstow Wetlands in London. And this is where the project started. And we just wanted to run through now a few aspects of how we approached the project, both in terms of the kind of methods and that kind of productive approach, and then some of the outcomes as well. So first of all is that it was a bit of a collaboration between the art and science. We worked with a biodiversity officer who works at the site, Ian Crump, who works for Thames Water, who was one of the owners of the Walthamstow wetlands. And that initial, the initial conversations that we had were very informative to the development of the whole piece. At an early kind of meeting, while walking around the wetlands, Ian relayed these fascinating stories from his knowledge of the wetlands about the eels that lived there and that migrate each year to the Sargasso Sea 3,000 miles away. So as you'll see later, the eel became an important component in the film that we made. The residency was a short residency. The whole project was only 3 months, so the residency was also part of this.
And the residency had different components. So we designed that we would actually, as well as spending time at the wetlands themselves and getting to know the different, the actual space of the wetlands and the people, and then working with the people, but getting to know, what it felt like to be there and across the changing seasons and the different birds and the different types of algae and all these different things we were learning about the time as that we were part of the residency. We punctuated this, if you like, with certain events where we invited other human participants to sort of collectively explore the wetlands and create some myths for a wetlands imaginary. So on the left, so we had a storytelling workshop, which was both with Alison O'Connor, who is from the Wildlife Trust, who did this guided walk, but also with Susan Butler, who's an author and artist. And on the right, you can see the recording is Gary Stewart, who's a sound artist who developed a sound piece throughout the residency with us and for the project. So really, this was again this kind of collaborative approach to a workshop where we invite people to experience the wetlands, and then we came back in and really ground them in the bodies within the wetlands site and to think about how their bodies would respond with the wetlands and build up that knowledge to the local site. And while this and the second part and the other part of this workshop was to then look at this how they could use some of that knowledge to develop their own myths for the wetlands.
So we also brought in some digital mapping to the workshop, which was based around the Ramsar Treaty from 1971, which is a cross-governmental national treaty to protect the wetlands. And the Ramsar website hosts an online kind of map, which shows thousands of websites that are protected by Ramsar around the globe. And so participants in the storytelling workshop could use these websites to select a wetland from around the world that they might have some kind of connection to, however varied and multiple they were, those connections. And that was part of the workshop, and the participants then downloaded these satellite images from these various different wetlands around the world with a map from the site and a little bit of information. And you'll see that this was used in the exhibition later on. Performance is also a key part of our practice, and so we devised a performance walk around the wetlands in which we performed, read out a script.
So I'm just going to read a bit of an extract from the performance, and then we'll talk about what it was. Okay, so it was really Marley's idea. They had been working on communicating with humans for years. Many attempts had been made before and failed again. Some listened, many could not. We had to transmit messages that humans might not be ready to hear, but needed to. Direct messages did not work, not one bit. We asked the earth herself to communicate. She tried to. She made great big gestures. The ocean swelled, the snow caps melted, the last polar bear died. The air became heavy and unbearably hot, but still the humans did not hear. Marley had long ago known that we needed to introduce structures that could provide highly plastic, physiological and morphological responses to interacting with the earth, that could interact, that could carry messages across spatial and temporal domains, that could hide their true purpose in plain sight. Whatever form it takes, it needs to be strong, a fighter, and have superpowers. So the performance really we used the stories from the wetlands that we knew from Ian Crump, for example, but we also created stories with, like here you see with the reeds, or the story that the fiction that I just read out about was about called Fragmites, and we were using the different elements, the kind of really micro elements and the sort of less micro elements of the wetlands, the specific wetlands of Walthamstow, to fictionalize and tell myths for the wetlands. And we guided the participants, audience around the wetlands, and at each different point we would tell a new fiction. And it was an interactive performance, so at different sites we would ask people to join us in the performance. Yeah, and the other element we want to talk about is the film, which will show you a short extract from. So do you want to say something about the film?
So I think we'll just show a short clip first. intention was to partially draw together a variety of different pieces of material that we collected throughout the project, some of which were live recordings from Walthamstow wetlands, some of which was clips from the research that came out of the conversations with scientists and with other participants. And so the film is one component part of the kind of assemblage of different elements that we brought together later to work in different ways to kind of evoke in a very open-ended way what this Wetlands Imaginary could possibly be.
Okay, so the film is part of the exhibition. So if you're interested in seeing the whole film, then it's part of the conference exhibition. So a hugely important part of the work was bringing in the global perspective, but also Indigenous knowledges.
So we worked with an artist from the Noongar people in Australia, who are Indigenous peoples of Western Australia and Perth. And Rod had produced a video that we showed at the exhibition, which talked about the way that the Noongar peoples relate to the land, which is clearly a very important part of the Indigenous peoples of Australia's kind of culture and so on, and understanding of the world. And so the question of a Wetlands Imaginary, we found it was essential to include and have as part of that this particular position on the relationships between humans, non-humans, and the earth. And in the clip that we showed, Rod talks through particular ceremonies and relationships to the water and the wetlands. So that again was part of the wider exhibition that we staged.
And we also involved popular culture. So we're very aware that we wanted to bring in this kind of how wetlands have been portrayed and represented across popular culture, whether that's Swamp Thing or the very, there's many kind of cartoons and films and TV programs that explore this was explore this kind of othering of wetlands as and so we incorporated that into to bring in the kind of different discourses around wetlands and was also part of the kind of decolonial approach. So yeah, there's more about that in which we'll talk about, but yeah, but it was part of the exhibition.
And as we've said, this exhibition happened at the end of the period of the project. It was a festival that happened in Wynn Gallery in Walthamstow in the centre. And so the film was shown as part of this day, and about creating the different aspects of this Wetlands Imaginary that the public could kind of experience and move between these different things. So the film was shown. Gary Stewart, that we showed earlier, taking the field recordings, kind of performed a live soundtrack to the film in the space with some of the field recordings and other sounds. And yeah, various people in the public could kind of experience that. The maps and satellite images from the workshop were kind of displayed, and screens showed Rod's film and the kind of popular culture kind of aspects. So that draws us to the end of the talk, and hopefully what we wanted to kind of communicate through that kind of description of the project was about the different ways that the project, using the different disciplines, using the different modes of working, allowed us to explore this open-ended question of a Wetlands Imaginary.
and how the Wetlands Imaginary as an ecological and imaginative space for human and importantly more than human coexistence, and as a metaphor for new forms of kind of multi-species solidarity.
In preparation for this event, we chatted with Rod about sharing his film. He responded, "You have my blessings to share the film." So we are delighted to share with you Rod's film, Our Land is Talking, which will run for about 9 minutes.
My name's Rod Garland. I'm a Noongar artist now living in Broome. Northern is my hometown, where I've been born and bred. It was known by our old people, my grandfather Jubich, as Najuk, meaning a place of the bubbling springs. We lived there all our lives, and I've been taught by my old people that there's 2 rivers that flow there. So the river that the whitefellas see, and then there's a river that runs underneath where the snake travels. So we use the craft glue. So I get a brush and I lay down all the glue, and then I sprinkle the sand as I'm going until we've covered the whole canvas. This is we call it river sand, but it's actually the topsoil that's coming in off the farmlands, because all the natural barriers like the trees and the bush shrubs and everything have been taken from the land. Then there's nothing holding the topsoil back on country, and it's just choking the river system. We've had a government program up around our area where they're dredging this silt out of the river pools, and they were piling it up at the Khairani pool there, and I said, what can I use it for? Geez, I might just chuck it on some canvas and see if I can paint with it. And that's how my art evolved as a river sand artist, and it's how people kind of recognise that it's my work. We asked permission for that, and we've always done it through hunting, through gathering, to even collecting bush medicines, that we would always ask our ancestors if it'd be right for us to come in and take this, and we tell them what we want to do with it. We would ask old people to give us that blessing, and I've used that same approach to ask permission to take the river sand from the waterhole to use in my art, to tell our family stories. We get a little cool wind that blows over us as a sign of acceptance, but if you don't get it, then you don't take it. Or if you hear a branch fall from a tree or something that makes you alert, then you say, no, we'll have to leave now, or it's time to go. Yeah. Well, we've divided up in 6 spaces here, and that just solely represents a Noongar native title claim, and it represents the 6 claimant groups for our Budja, for our country in the southwest. Here we've outlined this bankshire. The bankshire was used in ceremony as part of the men's headdress as well, but it was also used for carrying fire, and the seeds were collected and used for making bread. This is a Balga Bush. He had about 101 uses, this plant here, for our people. It's one of the most versatile plants in our plant kingdom. And when we have big ceremony, we burn one of these to give cleansing to all of our people and our communities. The Aboriginal flag that I've used to represent our people here, the black is a representation of our people. The red is from the massacres of the blood that was shed upon our land when the Europeans come to our country. And the yellow represents a better future or a new day, brighter day for our people. Christmas tree. Moye is that Noongar name, is the most sacred of our plants. It was a tree where our family, when they passed on, their spirit would rest there first, at that tree. And they would rest there before they went on to a place that the old people called Khairani, which is Aboriginal heaven beyond the sea. And we're not allowed to sit in the shade of that tree, and we're not allowed to break any of the branches from that tree. It's very sacred. So I use the symbol of the water, the ripples, in my paintings to represent the healing places, the healing pools along our river where we go to wash ourselves and clean our spirit, make us all strong, you know. These ones up here along the Avon River, Gungurna we call it, And this one is Burlong, Catrine, Red Bank, and this is a deep pool near Tujay, and that's Wayanga at the end there. So all sacred pools for our people, and our mother's family run along that river. But the water is giver of life, and that's why I use it in my symbols today, that it represents that very thing about healing ourselves at the waterholes and our connection to the rainbow serpent, because our family, we snake people. Yeah. So this one here, that the Kwandong fruit, is from my father's country, which is the Baladong people, and they always collect this in the season to make their bush jams. So my totem is the emu. In Noongar we call it Wach. So the emu hand over my hand, this is my special gift or my connection to the water. It's our healing. So Wach is my totem, and I can't eat that one. I must always protect this one. And that's part of a system that's been in place within our culture right across Australia. And it's why our animals have still survived, because of that very system. So this is a meeting place. And usually when we have it for sitting, then it speaks of woman's business. So men's business and woman's business was always separate and still is today. Wallich is the eagle, and this symbol here of the Southern Cross reminds us that he was the one that was responsible for creating our laws of our Noongar land and sea and for its people. This corner section here represents Noongar Buja, our land, Aboriginal land. The footprints are of our people walking across our country, hunting and gathering, looking after country. And that one there is the black cockatoo, Manat Mat. And he reminds us of our warriors, and he carries these special red feathers that represent our Noongar country, or a lot of people distinguish those feathers as a part of us. For me, they really do remind us of our strong warriors that walked our country, you know. This figure here is the chest markings is of my great-great-grandfather Jubich. He's a senior lawman for Wajak country here, who is a master of ceremony and is to sing the songs for this country. And these are his traditional markings. But it also represents myself as a Noongar man for this country, and that's why I've done the face with the lines coming straight down, which means self. Ceremony in our country made us strong. Ceremony also implemented and kept our law for this country strong. The law of the land, the law of its people, and its culture. Ceremony was also about giving thanks and gratitude to the great spirits and for providing us with a beautiful country and plenty full of food. And that's why our people have always looked after the country, because we know that the country would look after us in return. And that's always been a part of our upbringing as Aboriginal people, the first carers of this land.
Okay, so then I suppose we also thank all Sam, Paula and Rod for the sharing of this that we just watched. They're not with us today, but as I said before, if you have any questions that you would like to direct to them, then you can also go through us and we'll facilitate that. I also shared the link there of a few of them, so you could also go through that way. And then otherwise, we would move a bit onto the discussion part of this session. So I just wanted to ask first off if anyone has any thoughts they want to share from what we just watched, and then we can kind of transition into a bit of a discussion. So yeah, go ahead. You can also unmute yourself. You can put it in the chat as well, whatever you feel most comfortable with.
I think there was one question before.
Yeah, sure.
But
you're finding it?
I'm trying.
Well, maybe somebody, if they already have one, you can put it in the meantime, I suppose, while we have a look. And maybe I know sometimes people find it a bit more difficult to get the discussion started. So I'm just going to do a special call out to any RE-PEAT team members who want to go ahead and get the discussion started, break the ice a little bit.
Yeah, I was kind of just thinking of something, but it's maybe related to the session in general. Because I feel like when we were talking about in between a lot today, we were always kind of looking at it in this positive light. And I think that is really important. But then I was also thinking like, what are the maybe downsides of being trapped in the in between? And then I was kind of thinking of, like Khairani's first presentation and how like strong and decisive your language was, and how you like called out the colonizers, and like also how that's so important sometimes to not be in the in between. And I don't know, I was just kind of thinking maybe also like the dangers of like falling in the in between, or being able to like not able to see these kind of distinctions. I don't know if anyone has any follow-up thoughts. Or
does anyone have any other thoughts on that? Or I guess, sure, I'll jump in. I want to say thank you so much for showing that work, and I feel sad that we can't speak in person because of the technical issues. But I hope that we'll continue to be in touch with the artists we just saw and spark further discussion. Thank you, Amara. I think a lot of what I was thinking about, particularly with Rod's film, is this concept of there being different realities and different frameworks that may not be accessible to everyone, and how coloniality is also coloniality of thinking knowledge is for everyone, and everyone means exposure to colonization. I'll get to why this connects to Peatlands in a little bit. So one phrase that really jumped out for me from Rod's film was there are two rivers: the river that white fellas can see, and the river, in his words, and the river that runs beneath it, where the snake, where the snake is. And I often think about that in terms of just Indigenous peoples' knowledge and realities, in particular with regards to peatlands, because I think this very colonial idea of knowledge should be open and for everyone doesn't take into account that it is a dangerous landscape. There have been instances of Indonesian indigenous communities providing maps, for instance, right, of their territory, of their lands, as a gesture of goodwill, right? As like these, we've mapped this over a long period of time, here are our maps, and then those maps then get into the hands of corporate entities who then exploit those maps, right? I always get it's the same reason why I always get kind of happy when there's like side streets in Jakarta that Google Maps can't name, right? Because I think that this issue of privacy in terms of a surveillance state, right, and data, and how environmental information is transmitted and protected from corporate entities is actually really important when it comes to peatlands and wetlands. And I think it's interesting because I feel like as though there's always this expectation that we will be like native informants, or like provide all the secrets of our lands. And actually, like, is that, why do you think you have the right to that? Like, what are you going to do with that? Why do you think you have the right to that? Do you know how to use this information properly? Do you know the ethics of naming some places and not others? I think there are a lot of beautiful secrets that should be kept secret because it's not a safe land. Peatlands are not safe from corporate knowledge, and that includes knowledge. So how do you all, as people interested in peatlands, right, like gain information about Indigenous peatlands, but also understand like there's stuff that isn't for you, and you have to earn trust, right? So there's that aspect that I was thinking of. I'm not sure if that answers your question at all, but it's just something that popped into my mind.
I don't know, Mara, if you wanted to have any reflections back on that. You can also just put it in the chat otherwise. I'll give you a sec. And then otherwise, I see that I just put a little comment in the chat that people could also just put a star, and then we can kind of, I don't know, organize it a little bit. But also that so maybe then, Frankie, I would pass on to you. Although I would say as well, if there are non-repeat people, please go ahead and also ask questions. I'm not trying to show a preferential treatment or anything here. And Frankie, you can just speak through my mic. Yeah. We're also sitting next to each other, so we're pretending like we're in different rooms with different wallpaper, but you know.
But can you hear me when I speak now?
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, I wanted to a little bit second what Amara said as well. Like, it was, for me, like, your words were very clear and very direct, and there's something very powerful about that. Like, I think everyone was using the word sobering, which I thought was an interesting word. But like, there's something sobering about people being very direct in a way. So I wanted to just reflect on that as well. But yeah, maybe my thoughts was more like, you talked about like giving rights back to Indigenous people, and like a few different ways of having this process of decolonisation. And I wanted maybe to hear a few more thoughts on like, what's your vision of how we do this, and how we like debunk this whole mindset and system that we're in.
Thanks so much, Frankie. What an enormous topic. I'm not going to pretend to know, you know. And also, so much of this is so, as I mentioned, you know, so much of this is so geographically specific, right? I'm not going to pretend to speak for any, you know, Native American person or any, you know, Indigenous Latin American person. I can only speak from my small perspective. I think a plurality of Indigenous voices is really important, because, you know, there is the tendency to say like the rights and the legal structures and the processes of decolonization, it's actually quite simple, right? Land back, right? If you give the land back to Indigenous peoples, we will take care of it. But the way that happens, because we're under the control of various nation state and legal and political systems, will vary inevitably. I work in, as I mentioned, Decolonizing Arts Institute, and I'm really looking a lot at the materiality of like holdings that, and for instance, one thing I'm working on is the British Museum has lots of these baggies that have soil and bone, and they're from Indonesia, and they're listed as animal remains, in brackets possibly, human remains, in brackets possibly. And they're from like 3000 BC. And I'm just thinking like, what is actually the value of keeping soil in the British Museum in London, right? Like with bone, that, by the way, is possibly animal first before possibly human, right? I think that there needs to be restitution of objects such as these. So when we think of nature, right? I once did a talk, and a girl was like, we don't have nature here in London. And I was like, it is nature. Actually, London is a very forested city. That's another myth. But in institutions such as universities and museums, you know, I think the scientific structures, especially when talking about peatlands, I think that concepts of science need to be decolonized. And really, yes, London is a forest city, Katie. You really need to think about like how, you know, even UC Berkeley has lots of human remains of Native Americans that are just stored there, you know, and universities and institutions lie on the remains of people. So what does it mean when you're talking about environmental protection, but you think you have the right to keep environmental, you know, artifacts that also include maybe human artifacts in that, right? And I think that there's a distinction between the word decolonization and to decolonize something and anti-colonial sentiment, right? So to give an example, thank you to the people in the chat who are like, China is also a colonizer. Yes, absolutely. China is a huge culprit in Indonesia as well as in Africa, other parts of Asia. The reason why I focused so much on European colonialism was more because this remit was UK Anthology, right? And as mentioned, I wanted to show the connections between Europe and Asia. But 100%, China is also a huge player, is also a colonizing power. And as I mentioned also in the chat, people think of Indonesia and global South countries in terms of like monolithic nation states that, like, if you return artifacts and minerals and plants back to Indonesia, then that's a decolonial act, right? The restitution of objects is a decolonial act. But it is anti-colonial. You need to go further to understand that the Indonesian nation state is itself colonial. You know, Papua, where the largest gold mine in the world is, and where there's an enormous amount of palm oil plantations and an enormous amount of human suffering because it's all of this protected by the military. You know, Indonesia has been colonizing Papua for ages. They are who we call Black people in Indonesia, right? And there's so much racism, but beyond that, it's like full coloniality. And Javanese people, I'm half Javanese as well. So, you know, we are colonizers of other cultures because the power was concentrated. Jakarta is on the island of Java. The power is concentrated in Java. And actually the ways in which there's a difference between understanding that, okay, it's a decolonial act to return a Javanese stone that was owned by a Scottish lord back to Java, which really happened. And the Scottish lord asked for a lot of money for it, by the way. And then you also have to understand that Javanese culture is itself a colonizing culture, right? So there are levels to, there's layers to this as well. There's politics between ethnicities, and then even the naming of those ethnicities is political, right? You know, for instance, my father is an honorary member of the Oneida tribe for shared indigenous activism. I cannot say that I'm half Oneida because that's not how it works, right? Elizabeth Warren saying she's part Native American, it's not the same as like somebody actually, you know, there's like enrollment in a tribe, right, is different from saying, from like the very colonial view of race and the understanding of like bloodline, right? So I think that I'm going over them just to show that there is it's not going to be easy. I think the situation in Palestine shows it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be popular. And this is something that I saw on Twitter a little while ago. Somebody was like, decolonization is not popular. It's violent, you know, people are going to be against it. But it 100% needs to happen. It's the way we need to go, because otherwise, as I mentioned, it's just moving the parts around on the board, but you're not actually solving something. It's the same as, you know, the US providing aid to rebuild for Palestinians, but then they also give like hundreds of billions of dollars in military warfare aid to Israel. It's kind of the same logic as like this whole developmentalist idea, right, of aid. Like, I used to work in the development industry and I used to work as a journalist as well. And it was, you know, it was really hard to talk about the environment and convince, you know, even white journalists on the environment that their way of thinking needed to be shifted. I think it's going to take all of us. I think it's not an easy process. It needs to happen in all kinds of ways, right? I can try and do it from the arts, as with, you know, my colleagues. Other people approach it from like a decolonizing science approach. There are people in the States who are doing a lot of that. It really needs to be in every aspect of life. And also to understand that these categories, so much of these categories, you know, are very colonial, right? Disciplinary boundaries, right? Educational systems, you know, like citational politics, like the politics of saying like, who do you cite as being the discoverer of something scientific with related to peatlands, right? When indigenous peoples have probably known that for hundreds and hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. Why are you citing the one, you know, the first white male, usually male scientist who quote unquote discovers something about the peatlands? You know, I mean, we see these kinds of politics all the time. It's a lot. I don't know if I can, there's so much. I would like to give a special shout out to Leanne Bitasamosake Simpson and this incredible book. I'm actually, I'm interviewing her for something and I can't wait. But to talk to her more about this book, but it's Nupiming, The Cure for White Ladies. And it's written from, it's such a beautiful book. And we've already begun the interview and she said to me, you know, I didn't write it to be a commercial literary success. It's written from a real Indigenous perspective with regards to like sentient nature and human nature relations in a way that, again, it's not meant to be explained to you. You know what I mean? Like it's an inside thing. It's for Indigenous peoples of her tribe. But it's so beautiful, and her thinking in general. The book, As We Have Always Done, I strongly urge you to search out Leanne Simpson's work, As We Have Always Done. That book is a nonfiction book about Indigenous resistance. It's something that's always existed, right? I recently spoke to a professor from the University of Hawaii in conversation, and we were talking about how, you know, people talk about apocalypses, but again, this is from a very colonial view of what might happen. Apocalypses have already happened. If you're on United States land or Canadian land or New Zealand land or Australian land, as Rod showed in his video, right? It's the blood of massacres. And also in Indonesia, I mean, people think of Bali as a destination place. Bali has the mass graves of so many people who were killed in the genocide. But it's not marketed as that, right? It's marketed as a paradisiacal island because of, again, this is the importance of reworking our imagination in all ways, including in the arts. Because there was this movement of landscape painting of Indonesia as like a pristine paradise called Mooi Indi. That is Dutch, obviously, means beautiful Indies. And there's this Indonesian painter who coined that term as like, this is how we were taught to landscape paint, to literally paint over the fact that there's colonial violence here and that there's environmental violence here, you know? So if you have to also decolonize people's thinking about tourism, about, sorry, I'm just reading the chat. I think somebody said, oh yes, Frankie's AKA the discovery of the peat, quote unquote, in the Congo Basin. Exactly. There's a lot of peat discovery. And about like factual things that Indigenous peoples have always known. So to always question, even as an Indigenous person, you know, to always question your beliefs, because what is true for your group of people isn't the same for a group of people in the next village or in the next place. The way we see nature is different. In my mom's village in West Sumatra, there's no north, south, east, west. There's just upstream, downstream. The words for north, south, east, west do not exist. So you're talking about psychogeographies, and you're talking about honoring those differences, right, in a really respectful way. And that means giving Indigenous peoples a real platform, not just tokenizing us. That means really giving us, you know, putting us at the forefront and allowing us to lead conversations rather than, here's Western science, Indigenous person, come back me up on this carbon regime. Thanks for listening. As you know, I tend to go off.
No, you're most welcome to. I am aware a little bit of the time, which is an unfortunate, I don't know, occurrence that's happening. So, I mean, I think most people are on the platform, the event platform. So I would encourage people to also maybe share some reflections there. If the books that you mentioned, maybe you could write them there, Oka, for people to go and discover and read a bit more about this kind of thinking and decolonizing and the ways that we can do that. And then I would just maybe ask if anyone, including yourself, Oka, has any final words that they want to end the session on, that you're most welcome to do that.
I just want to say thank you to everyone who's attended, and thank you so much to RE-PEAT. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what you all do in the future and to continuing this discussion.
Thank you. The same to you. It was really, and I know I started the session by saying it's the final block and now it's time for me to actually enjoy the sessions because I'm not having the to-do list, but I can say that I think it was my favorite session so far, and I don't know. I think that was, you know, partly because I'm a bit more relaxed, partly because it was really amazing. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And favoritism, yeah, I do apologize everybody for that. We can also just chalk it down to I was very, very much engaged in the session. And now, yeah, I think continue the conversation, and thank you so very much.
Thank you both so much.
Enjoy the rest of your day, evening, everything like that. Bye.